Welcome to the first part of our set of 3 videos looking at the synoptic materials for India and China. Part 1 is going to look at this question, which is basically to what extent are China and India superpowers? Now, typical questions might literally be, to what extent are they superpowers? It might be compare and contrast the superpower status of the two countries, or it might be locating the countries on the superpower hierarchy that we'll look at in a second. Now, before we go any further, it's really important we've got a clear understanding of what we mean by a superpower. And having read some of the essays, I think it's worth highlighting one key idea in particular, which is a superpower is a country which has the ability to project power on a global scale. And in particular, I want to focus in on that word, project. That's the key here. Okay, it's that ability to influence people outside of national borders. So for this particular question, it's really important you're focusing on the ability to project power. Now, there's a whole host of reasons why you might actually have superpower status. Traditionally, superpower status has been defined by hard power, what we call military power, but also increasingly economic power, demographic power, the access to natural resources, geopolitical power, and cultural or soft power has increasingly become important. And in fact, there's a nice concept, a guy called Nye, who says that, talks about smart power, which is basically hard power plus soft power. You put those two together, you use them effectively, you have what he calls smart power. So, something to think about. Now, a good place to start would be looking at geopolitical power. For some reason, the exam board have decided to include figure 15 without making reference to China and India. Now, an intelligent guess would be that you are going to be expected to locate China and India on that scale. It's also worth just thinking about where we are at the moment. So at the moment, there is only one true global superpower, and that's the USA. That means that we're currently living in what's called a unipolar world, i.e. one dominated by a single power. I guess the whole part of the resource book is a question of whether that will turn into a bi or even a multipolar world over the next 50, 100 years. And I guess that's the challenge you need to look at. But to start with, let's just think about the geopolitical power that China and India have got. Well, we can start by looking at this first paragraph. And first of all, we can see that actually a couple of things comes out of it. It talks about demography, with the fact that there's over 1 billion people in both countries, and also talking about economy here. But we'll come into that in more detail. Something that's quite interesting is to think about, in terms of geopolitical power, is to think about the membership of international institutions. And what's interesting here is that we can see that China and India have some membership, but nowhere near compared to, say, for example, USA or the EU. So if we look at it, for example, we can see that China does have access to the UN Security Council, India doesn't. We can see that both are members of the G20 and both are members of the WTO. But neither is a member of the G8, neither is a member of NATO, neither is a member of the IMF. What that means is that in terms of geopolitical power, China has got a veto on the UN Security Council and is therefore probably more powerful, substantially more powerful geopolitically than India on the global scale. One thing that is worth mentioning is that to get around this sort of dominance of the IMF by America, both India and China have invested heavily in their own multinational institutions. So the BRIC Bank, for example, would be a good example where Russia, India, China have actually invested heavily to try and get around issues of American dominance of these multinational institutions. Now, in addition to geopolitical power, membership of international bodies, hard power has to be taken into account on this question. Now, both India and China have got vast land armies, huge numbers of men, and that comes partly from its huge populations. However, what's interesting is when you then have a look at military spending. Because despite the fact they both have huge standing armies, compared to America, actually both have relatively small budgets in comparison. Having said that, America's budget, 640 billion, is about half of all the world's spending. China, if you have a look at the graph, is rapidly catching up. It's now somewhere near 200 billion, so it's still a third of America's spending, but if you look at the trend, that will take something like 40 to 50 years before they catch up. So China's military might increasing significantly. Now, the other issue to bear in mind is that both are nuclear powers. So again, with that comes sort of the ultimate sort of weaponry. With that comes significant military power. So again, you can argue both substantial military power, but not on a comparison with America. Now, as we said earlier, one of the more important elements of modern superpower status is economic power. And we see that with America, with its roles of its big TNCs, McDonald's and so on. But when we come to look at China and India, we see actually some similarities and some differences. First of all, just in ties of GDP, it's worth having a look at the comparison between China and India. So China's GDP is coming out somewhere over $9 trillion. Compare that to India's just under $2 trillion. So about four and a bit times larger GDP for China than India. Now, China actually has the second largest GDP, but recently, interestingly, the World Bank has just published data saying if you take into account the purchasing power parity, actually China's GDP now is actually greater than USA's. So you are talking about a huge economic power that comes from that GDP. Just having GDP, though, on its own, in itself, doesn't allow you to project power. So it's also worth thinking about imports, exports, and just looking at industry and trade in a wider setting. Now, interestingly, what we can see that both China and India do have an issue, particularly India. If we look at the imports, what we'll see is that India, oil, largest import, coal coming in the third largest import, gas, the fifth largest import. That's indicative of a country which is energy insecure. And there is a question mark about whether you can be truly a true superpower if you are at risk of being energy insecure because you're importing so much. China looks slightly better. You'll notice there's no coal, there's no gas, but there is oil. So again, energy insecure in terms of oil is a point worth mentioning if you're talking about superpower status. Neither of these countries have vast quantities of oil to rely on. Another issue which suggests that actually they do have superpower status and that this is going to grow over time is their growth rates. It's worth having a look here and noticing that really the long-term average for China is somewhere just under 10%, whereas for India the growth rate is somewhere again about 6-7% average. That's not bad considering that since 2008 we've hardly grown at all, and that for a developed country 1 or 2% annual growth rate is considered exceptionally well. So again, there's evidence here of substantial economic growth, substantial economic power from its GDP, but some issues to do with importing energy and being energy insecure. So else worth just mentioning is if you look at India and China and just look at what they're actually exporting, it is very different. China, very much electronics, equipment, secondary manufacturing. India, slightly more interesting, a wider range of products. Some primary products, rice for example, manufactured products, cars, jewellery, but also some high tech in there as well. So medicines, for example, and India has developed one of the largest biotech industries in the world. So again, perhaps a more diverse economy, again, could be seen as an economic strength. Now, having talked about economic power, it's worth coming back to that idea of projecting power. Purely having a large GDP itself doesn't guarantee you power, doesn't give you influence. What does give you influence is when you've got big TNCs able to exert that power. Now, what's really interesting is you have a look here, what you'll see, perhaps the most interesting thing here is figure 4. If you look, what you'll see is that there has been a global shift in power and TNCs in terms of these Fortune 500 companies, i.e. the largest companies in the world. We'll see that USA has actually gone in decline from 2004 to 2014. Japan, even more so. But China has been the big winner. It's gone from 16 to 95. That's a 500% increase. India, on the other hand, 4 to 8. So, it's not fair to say that India has no influence. Some of those large TNCs do have massive impacts. We can think in Britain, for example, Tata Steel is a big employer. In fact, is involved in closing the Port Talbot steelworks. So they do have TNCs which have global reach and have global impacts, but compared to China, substantially less impact on a global scale in terms of business. So that's again a clear piece of evidence of China being a far more powerful economic superpower than India. Now, in addition to economic and military power, another issue to think about is what we call demographic power. Demographic literally means people. And here you've got the two countries in the world with over 1 billion people. Such a large number of people gives you power in a number of ways. First of all, it gives you a vast workforce. And we can see that in the factories in China and the sweatshops and such in India. Large numbers of people also gives you power, as we said, huge standing armies, some of the largest organisations, armies in the world. The other issue in terms of demographics is thinking about this idea of demographic dividend. Yes, it's a large number of people, but both countries are benefiting or have benefited from a young population. Now, China's introduction of the one-child policy meant that during the 80s, 90s, and even up until now, it benefited from a fall in birth rate and fall in death rate, which meant that increasingly it had a large young population. As you can see, that actually is starting to fall away now. And by the time we get to 2050, in fact, the estimates are saying that over a quarter of the population will be over 65. India, on the other hand, it's starting to actually really get to the stage where it's benefiting from that young population. It's got one of the youngest populations in the world. Its population is continuing to grow. Its birth rate isn't falling the same way, although it is falling, not falling the same way that China did. It therefore is potentially has a huge demographic dividend, particularly in the short term. We'll come back to look at dependency ratios and this data in more detail, but for now it's this idea that both countries get power from their huge populations. One area where India does arguably do better than China is in the issue of soft power. Now, one example of this could be looking at the number of films made. And interestingly, if you actually look at the number of films produced, actually India is way above the largest producer of films. Also, you'll notice that actually of those films, they actually have the largest audience. Now, I've got to be slightly careful here because much of this is for domestic audience. But actually you could argue that India has a much bigger place in the global culture than China does. One of the reasons for that is not only is it part of the Commonwealth and it's got those colonial ties with England, Britain, but also it speaks English. Even if only as a second language, it's got one of the largest numbers of English speakers in the world, and that means that it has the ability to actually communicate more effectively with overseas companies and businesses, and you could argue that that actual soft power, that cultural ties, means it's able to project its power more effectively than China. Maybe not as effectively, say, as America, but certainly there's an argument here it's more than China. Now, one final thing to consider about superpower status, and this is more relevant perhaps for India than China, is just the levels of poverty and the quality of life of its population. And can a country truly claim to be a superpower if actually it's got the largest proportion of people living in poverty anywhere in the world? And you could quite happily argue that that can't be a true superpower. So something to take into account when you're thinking about this is view 2 in particular, which I think is quite interesting, quite damning really about India's status in the world. But it's also interesting to have a look at figure 6 and think about this idea of contrasting visions and the social progress index. What's interesting when you look at this is that you can actually see that in every criteria, India does worse than China, with the one exception of this OP score, this opportunity score. Now, doing a little bit of digging, what was quite interesting is that you can actually see the breakdown of the scores on this graph here. And basically, the solid dots with the solid lines is China. The dots which aren't connected and tend to be a lighter colour are India. And what you actually see is that for basic human needs, foundational well-being, India is worse than China on every single criteria. And in fact, opportunity, what's really interesting for opportunity, is that when you look at the 4 criteria, you actually see that even here, that China does better for personal freedom and choice, does access to advanced education substantially better, tolerance and inclusion much better. It's only personal rights coming from that one party authoritarian government that makes the difference. But that actually is, interestingly enough, significant enough to actually put India ahead of China on that one indicator. But again, just that further evidence that there are significant social issues in India which you could argue prevent it from becoming a superpower, or even being a superpower or an emerging superpower now. So to conclude this video, there's 2 things you need to be able to do. You need to be able to make sure that you can describe how India and China, the characteristics of those 2 countries give them certain superpower statuses, and be able to evaluate to what extent they actually are true superpowers at the moment. You also need to be aware of the similarities and differences, the sort of comparison and contrast type question between China and India, and need to be able to make sure, again, that you know your evidence from the Synoptic booklet and wider evidence about the different strengths and weaknesses that the 2 countries have. If you want to take this further, I suggest what you do, you draw up a table of the 2 superpowers and use the set criteria that we started with to analyse them, or even just do a very large Venn diagram, compare and contrast the similarities and differences. You're also welcome to have a go at exam questions, and if you do, please give them to us, email them to us or whatever, and we'll have a look at them. So I hope this has been of some use. We'll be following this up with 2 more videos. But in the meantime, if you have any questions, don't be frightened to ask. Thanks ever so much.